Okay, so this is going to be the first lecture on the first topic in advanced human physiology. So today we're going to be talking about cellular transport. So, oops. Okay, so to introduce the kind of concept of transport and its importance for physiology, let's imagine that you are a single-celled aerobic, meaning you use oxygen for metabolism, heterotrophic organism. Heterotrophic meaning you get your food from outside. You don't do photosynthesis. Okay, so this is basically the cell that is the ancestor of all animals. All of our cells are basically little single-celled organisms of this type. Okay, so this is you. Your main problem in life, right? The main problem of life, is to maintain homeostasis, to keep your internal environment more or less constant. Okay, and this is really a problem of transport. Okay, so let's think about, so sort of the main thing you do inside your cell is metabolism in order to generate ATP, and ATP is the fuel that lets you do the things you need to do to keep yourself alive, to maintain that homeostasis. Okay. Well, so what do you need to keep yourself alive? So let's think about for metabolism. To do metabolism, to be able to generate ATP, first of all, you need fuel, so nutrients, and you get those from the outside. So you need to transport them in, right? We're heterotrophic. We're not doing photosynthesis. I also said that we're aerobic organisms, so we're also going to need oxygen, right? We're doing aerobic metabolism. And in the process of doing metabolism, we generate a couple of things that we need to get rid of. So first of all, there are sort of breakdown products. We're just going to call them metabolic wastes. And we need to be able to get rid of those. They'll get us sick if they accumulate inside the cell. We also need to get rid of, there's another waste product that metabolism generates, right, which is CO2. Okay, so already we're seeing that for metabolism we need to do a fair bit of transport. And then let's think about just some of the other things. So for homeostasis, we're swimming around in this environment. Some of the things that we need to sort of regulate. So one that we need to make sure we can regulate is our volume. Okay, so one of our big jobs is to make sure that the volume of our cells is stable, and the main thing that makes us up is water. So we need to regulate water, the water inside of our cells, and basically move it in or out as needed. But it turns out that you actually have to be careful when you're moving water back and forth, because one of the things that can change, say if you take a whole bunch of water in, one of the things that can change is the concentration of all the solutes inside the cell can change. So as you're moving water, you also have to be able to move basically solutes, or I'm just going to say ions. Those are the main solutes, so things like sodium chloride. So in order to regulate your osmolarity, as you're moving water back and forth, you also need to move ions back and forth. There's actually another particular ion that I'm going to just focus on because of how vital it is for life. There's one particular ion that you really need to regulate very carefully, which is hydrogen ion, right? So hydrogen ion concentration is what we measure as pH, and small imbalances of pH can be really disruptive to the molecules of a cell. So you need to make sure you can regulate those. So Really, most of what we do in maintaining homeostasis can be thought of as a basically a transport problem. Uh, and so just sort of illustrating the central importance of transport for life. And then you know, so you need to be able to transport things, but even more important and even more challenging, you need to know what transport needs to occur. You need to be able to regulate the transport. Okay, I mean, you can't just put a hole in the membrane and hope that everything will regulate itself and keep you in homeostasis. You need to keep track of how much water, how much ions, what your pH is, and then change those things. You need to regulate them. You need to keep track of them and regulate them. And as you hopefully remember from reading in that background material, the main process that regulates things in organisms, including us, is a process called negative feedback. Okay, so in a negative feedback system, there's a receptor that senses the state of a certain variable, and it compares that state to a set point. So then there's a control center that knows what the set point is. It reads what the value of the variable is coming in from the receptor, and it decides if the variable is too high, higher than the set point, or lower than the set point, that some change needs to happen. And then the control center talks to an effector that accomplishes that change and hopefully brings the system back toward the set point. So like in your home, you have a temperature regulating system. You have there's a thermostat, but built into the thermostat is a thermometer. So the thermometer is the receptor for temperature, detects what the temperature is. The thermostat has the set point, right, where you put the set point, on the thermostat, and the thermostat can say, okay, the temperature is, say, below the set point, and the thermostat says, all right, if it's below, I know what I need to do. I need to talk to the heater, right, the furnace, say, which is the effector in this case, and tell it to add heat. So, for instance, if you so let's say this is a graph of the process, right? So you have temperature over time. This sort of dashed line here is the set point. This is where the temperature should be, and say it's tooling along at the set point and everything's fine. And then something happens. Say someone comes in through the front door on a cold day. Temperature starts to drop. So this regulatory system gets this error signal. There's an error, a difference between the value, the desired value, and the set point. That's an error. So it sees in this case that there's a negative error. The variable is below the set point, and it wants to correct that, and so it creates a response that's in the opposite direction of the error. This is why we call it negative feedback. The response is opposite to the error. So when there's and in fact it's also proportional. So a bigger error gives a bigger response. Here the error is big, so there's a big push the other direction. As the error gets smaller and smaller, the response also gets smaller and smaller. This is something we'll see actually in a lot of body systems. The regulatory system gives bigger responses to bigger errors, smaller responses to smaller errors, and the response eventually pushes the variable back to the set value of the set point, at which point there's no more error, and therefore the system doesn't give a response. Okay, this is the system that really all living organisms use to maintain homeostasis. Okay, to decide what needs to happen and in many cases what transport needs to happen. So so when we talked about transport, right? There's a lot of work that the cell has to do. If we're a single-celled organism, you have to sort of keep track of all these things and regulate them. Hard enough. Suppose you're a multicellular organism, though. Okay, so like us, most of our body cells live inside the body, surrounded by body fluids, but far away from the external environment, which is out here. So if our cells in here, say, need extra nutrients, that they're having higher metabolic needs, so they need more glucose, say, they can't just suck it up from the external, from the fluid around them. The fluid around them is not the fluid of the world that might have glucose around. It's the fluid inside the body. So to get the cells to regulate transport of cells inside the body, a multicellular organism needs to create what we call organ systems. Okay, it needs to create ways to move material from the external environment to the internal cellular environment, and back out, and to keep track of what needs to move in and out from these cells. Okay, so and different organ systems in the body are sort of devoted to regulating different variables for our internal cells. Okay, so for instance, we talked about how cells need nutrients and oxygen, things that sort of the fuels to provide metabolism. So we have intake systems in our bodies to bring those things in. So nutrients, etc., come in through the gastrointestinal system. Oxygen comes in through a different system, the respiratory system. So we have these intake systems. Similarly, we said that our cells produce waste that needs to be eliminated. So that's true for the cells of our bodies as well. But of course, they can't just excrete it out into the world, right? They need to actually have it transported out of the body. So there are output organ systems. So for metabolic wastes, the wastes go into the renal system, so the kidneys, and then get excreted as urine. Right, so there's metabolic waste here, and there's also CO2, another waste. So CO2 gets excreted by the lungs. So the lungs are an intake system for O2, they're an output system for CO2. There's also some, but not much, metabolic waste that gets eliminated via the gastrointestinal system, but not much. Really, most of it happens via the renal system. And then one of the things that's obvious, so you've got your lungs up here, you've got the cells down here. Oxygen comes in through the lungs, and the cells are, say, down in your toe. You're going to need a way of getting the oxygen to the cells, and vice versa. The waste from the cells need to make it to the kidneys, right? So one of the things you have to have in a multicellular organism is a circulatory system, a system for basically moving material from one location to another so that these organs can communicate with one another, so that materials can get to where they need to go. So the heart and the blood vessels are obviously a critical component of regulation in multicellular organisms. Okay, and then the last set of systems you need in a multicellular organism is something that's not really shown in this image. But let's say, for instance, that these cells start metabolizing more. Say they're muscle cells and you're exercising. So the metabolic needs go up. they're going to need more oxygen. You're going to need to absorb more oxygen from the air to supply the needs of these cells. But how in the heck are the lungs going to know that the cells need more oxygen? The cells, don't have a direct means of communication. So what you need are regulatory organ systems. And there are basically two systems that are responsible for kind of regulating and coordinating the physiology of the body. So there's the nervous system and the endocrine system. Right? So these are the signaling systems of the body. They can sort of detect when one place in the body, is having some, is out of whack, has some, need, some change in a state of the variable, and then they communicate to the other organ systems to help correct the whatever is out of whack with one and the other parts of the body. Okay, they can keep track of the variables in the body and kind of regulate other organs to correct for problems in various places in the body. And we're gonna talk a fair amount about one of the things I think that one of the themes of this course is going to be to say, let's look at how organ systems coordinate with one another. It's one of the, I think, the more kind of cooler things about how our bodies work. Is our lungs can do amazing things, but our lungs and our circulatory systems and our renal systems work together in a lot of ways, and to help basically keep the whole body in check. Okay. All right. So one of the concepts that I think is going to be important for understanding transport in the body is to look at how body fluids are organized and sort of the barriers that separate different body fluids in different places. Okay. So when we talk about fluid in the body, so first of all, there's what we call total body water. It's just all the fluid that's in the body, all the everywhere in all in your entire body, all the fluid is called total body water. But that fluid is separated into really two main compartments. Okay, so the first compartment is what we call intracellular fluid. And then the second major compartment is extracellular fluid. And these are just as they sound. Intracellular fluid is the fluid inside cells. Extracellular fluid is fluid around the cells. So, and actually you can break extracellular fluid down a little bit further. So there are sort of two main places where you find extracellular fluid. So one is the fluid inside blood vessels called plasma. The other one is the fluid that's just in the spaces within our tissues. It's outside of cells, but it's not in the circulatory system. It's just this fluid basically bathing our cells called interstitial fluid. And while this picture makes it look like there's lots of ECF and not a lot of ICF, it turns out that actually intracellular fluid's about 2/3 of total body water. And extracellular fluid is about 1/3. Okay. So this diagram up here shows these in a more sort of conceptual way, but it shows the proportions more accurately. So intracellular fluid, about 2/3 of the total. Extracellular fluid is about 1/3 of the total. Extracellular fluid is then divided into interstitial fluid and plasma, and don't worry about the proportions here. We'll actually talk about that later. Now, I said that the main distinction is between intercellular fluid and extracellular fluid. So, and why did I say that? And the reason is, so let's look at the barriers that separate these different fluid compartments, okay? So first, let's say, so the interstitial fluid versus plasma. That's actually not a very meaningful distinction, and here's why. If you look, so let's look at the barrier that separates interstitial fluid from plasma. So there's fluid in the plasma, fluid in the space around the cells. What separates those two spaces is the capillary wall. And capillary walls, in general, are very porous. Okay, so this is a capillary. The plasma flows through here, but there are big pores between the endothelial cells of the capillary. And really, most of the stuff that's in the plasma can just pass right through, back and forth. So water, ions, most small molecules. Okay, so there are some big proteins that can't pass, and of course cells can't. Cells can't pass out of the circulation. But really, essentially, there's almost no barrier between plasma and interstitial fluid. So we really can think of extracellular fluid as being one big compartment that's just sort of separated by capillary wall. And there's a capillary wall there, but it really has minimal role in separating these two compartments. They're almost identical. Whereas intracellular fluid versus extracellular fluid, right? So fluid inside cells, fluid outside cells, the barrier that separates those is the plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane, yeah, by the way, there are places in the body where capillary walls are quite tight. So what I said here about the capillaries having big pores isn't always true, but for our purposes, we're gonna, for the moment anyway, we're gonna assume it is. Okay, but the cell membrane, right? I'm sure, hopefully, you guys are very familiar with a diagram like this. Cell membrane is a very there's the fluid at different sides of the cell membrane is very different, okay, and that's because of the chemistry of the plasma membrane. Okay, so this is sort of a cross section of the plasma membrane, and in general, basically the composition of the plasma membrane is that it's phospholipid bilayer, right? So it's got this phosphate heads, lipid tails face inwards. So there's a sort of a core that's hydrophobic. The heads are hydrophilic. And this membrane, so this, so that sort of ignoring the proteins for now, let's just think about how this membrane works. So it's got this very hydrophobic core. So let's say we're going to look at extracellular fluid for a bit, and let's say we're going to sort of think about a sodium ion. Okay, sodium ions floating around out here, extracellular fluid. He can kind of bump up and hang out with the phospholipid, or the phosphate heads. The phosphate heads are hydrophilic. They're happy to hang out together. But the question is, can that sodium ion pass through into intracellular fluid? And the answer is no, because hydrophobic molecules don't like charged or polar things, right? So sodium is a charged thing, it's an ion, and it's highly repelled by the hydrophobic core of the membrane. So ions like sodium cannot pass through the membrane. Similarly, polar molecules like water cannot pass directly through. So we said that in extracellular fluid that the interstitial fluid and plasma have basically the same composition. But that is not true for interstitial fluid or intracellular fluid versus extracellular. And even more importantly, transport is limited. Okay, there are very few things that can directly pass from intracellular to extracellular space. Very few molecules that are sort of relevant to life can pass directly through the plasma membrane. Right? Most of the things that are important for life, like look back at this image. So ions, water, hydrogen ions, none of these things can pass directly through the membrane, nor can nutrients or metabolic waste. And that's actually that's why we have the membrane, the plasma membrane, so we can regulate transport. But it does present a challenge. We need to be able to move ions, water, H plus back and forth. How do we do it? And of course, you probably know the basic answer, which is these guys here that we sort of left out initially. So there are proteins in the membrane. There are transmembrane proteins, many of which serve as channels and allow things to pass through. And they're going to be a really, really important part of the story of cellular transport. Okay. So what I want to do now is make up sort of a table and say, sort of in a typical cell in the body at rest, what passes through the plasma membrane? So if I want to say sort of what are the materials that can pass back and forth between intracellular and extracellular fluid, I want to make a table of things that can and things that can't. Okay, so things that can, things that cannot. So first of all, here's some things that can pass pretty readily through: CO2 and O2. They're small, relatively nonpolar. So CO2 and O2 can pass back and forth pretty readily between intracellular and extracellular fluid. When we talk about transport of CO2 and O2, the plasma membrane is really not going to play much of a role. Another thing that can pass through, and this is a little tricky because I kind of just told you it couldn't, but one of the things that passes readily from intracellular to extracellular fluid and back is water. Well, right, I just told you that water can't pass through the plasma membrane. But one of the really key things about transport in the cells of the body is that every cell, with very few exceptions, every cell in the body has in it proteins that allow the passage of water. So this is water. And this is the protein in the membrane. There's water passing through back and forth. These proteins are called aquaporins. Okay? With the exception of a couple of types of cells in the kidney, all cells in the body have aquaporins on all sides. So here's epithelial cell. You see aquaporins in the apical side, aquaporins in the basal side. Okay, here's more aquaporins. There's different types of aquaporins, but it doesn't really matter. They're pores that allow passage of water. So the plasma membrane, as a rule, this membrane is permeable to water. Okay, and this is going to have a lot of important consequences when we think about, well, what happens if you add water to one place? What happens if you add ions to one place or versus another? We'll actually work through that during some of our problem-based learning. Okay. Before I go on to look at the mechanisms of transport, I want to mention a concept in transport that's pretty important in the body, which is the concept of epithelia. Okay, hopefully you're familiar with the concept. Epithelia refers to a type of tissue, right? Basically a lining tissue. So if you look in the body, everywhere where there's an interface between the external world, right? This is like say the intestine and then interstitial fluid. That interface between external fluid and internal fluid, you find a special type of tissue, which is this lining tissue, and that is epithelia. Okay, you find it in the lungs, you find it lining the blood vessels, you find it in the kidney. Forget about that. So this is a diagram showing basically the blueprint of an epithelial tissue. Hopefully you're kind of familiar with this concept. So epithelia is a sheet of cells. Just so we can orient ourselves, so this is, let's say, what we would call the lumen. This would be sort of the outside world. Say the lumen of the intestine or the alveolar space. Okay, down here we have interstitial fluid, blood. So the epithelia form this layer of cells. They're laterally attached to one another, right? You need the cells to be attached to one another, and they to form a layer. They're also attached at their base to this basement membrane. It's just sort of proteins and other extracellular matrix that these cells secrete, and then they attach to it. Okay, so they serve as this sort of lining. They're attached at the base. They're attached to each other at the sides. And they act as a barrier. They act to help regulate the passage of material from the outside world into the body. Okay, and they're really important in this role. A key fact about and here's a diagram sort of showing them moving things from the lumen into the cells, and then from the cells into the interstitial fluid. Most material that passes from the outside world to the body actually has to go through the cell. Okay, the epithelial cells actually move things into the cell, and then move things back out the other end. And they do that so that they can regulate what does pass through and what doesn't. Epithelial cells, like the rest of the cells in the body, though, also have aquaporins. And so, and water actually tends to flow quite freely from outside to inside and inside to outside in these cells. So they regulate the passage of solutes, and they're pretty careful about how they move solutes. But water tends to actually move passively, just sort of following the solutes through osmosis, right? Where solutes go, water's going to want to go. Something that's important about epithelia and how they do their job is that they are what we call polarized. Okay, so they have a membrane that faces the lumen of the outside world, and then they have another membrane down here that faces the body, right, the interstitial fluid. And the composition of those membranes tends to be different. So we call call this side the apical side, right? So really, all this stuff, right? And then we call this side the basal side. And in general, epithelial cells have different transport proteins and different sort of mechanisms at work in the apical membrane versus the basal membrane, and they use this difference to basically move certain things through and then prevent other things from going through. Okay, so as an example, the sodium-potassium pump, which hopefully you guys learned about in A&P, most epithelial cells have sodium-potassium pumps only located in the basal membrane, pump sodium out and bring potassium in here, and so they move, and then sodium comes in passively in the apical side, and then it gets pumped out through the basal side. Okay. Also want to let's see, and just a quick some terminology for you here. Absorption is the movement of material from the outside world into interstitial fluid. Secretion is movement of material from interstitial fluid to the outside world. Okay? Okay. So, okay. Let's see, hold on 1 second here. Okay, we're going to spend the rest of this topic talking about the mechanisms that accomplish transport. Okay, so and first, just to review the ways that transport can occur. So, sort of the major distinction in how cells transport things is that transport can either be passive, requiring no energy expenditure from the cell, or it can be active, which is just the meaning that it requires energy expenditure from the cell. And you might think, well, look, the cell has to, regulate and keep track of all these different solutes and when their levels are too high, move them back down. When levels are too low, bring them back up. It seems like this is all an active process, right? So probably active transport, you might think, is going to be the major player for transport, and passive transport seems like it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it turns out that that the forces behind passive transport are actually the main ones that drive where things go in the body. And that's just because the cell just doesn't have the power to actively regulate every single transport. And most of the transport that happens in the body is passive transport. So when we're thinking about where things go, we're mostly going to have to actually think about the forces of passive transport. And then it uses active transport to just sort of tweak that, to sort of keep those passive forces going in the direction that the body needs them to go. Okay? So we're going to really spend the majority of the time on passive transport and the forces of passive transport. Okay? And just sort of as an overview, there are three main forces that are involved in passive transport of molecules in the body. Okay, so the first force that drives passive transport is called a concentration gradient. Also known as diffusion. Okay, and this is something I'm sure you've encountered before in biology. Molecules will tend to go from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And this is a passive process. This isn't something the cell needs to work to make happen. This movement from high concentration to low concentration is a passive process that is just because of the nature of molecules, and we'll talk a little bit about why do they do this. But the force of concentration gradients moving things from one place to another is really, really key for physiology. Okay. The second force that drives passive transport is what we call the electrical gradient. Or I think I call it electrical potential. In the notes, but what that means is, so if there's a molecule that is charged, so these little molecules here are all negatively charged, and if there is an electrical gradient, or also called an electrical potential, if there's a difference in the electrical state, the voltage between one side of the cell and the other. So in this case, this side is negative, this side is positive. There's a negative voltage over here, a positive voltage over here. So charges like charges repel one another. So these little negatively charged molecules are actually going to be driven to move this way by this electrical gradient, this electrical potential. Okay, so an electrical gradient can drive transport passively. Again, the cell doesn't have to do anything to cause this transport. It's just the repulsion, the electrical repulsion that drives it. And then the third force that drives the movement, the passive movement of molecules in the body, is hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so this is probably fairly intuitive. If you put physical pressure and squish the molecules in one location, they're going to want to try to move towards another location, right? So if you have a balloon, or like a say a bottle, a soda bottle, and you squeeze the soda bottle, you increase pressure on the fluid, on the molecules in the bottle, they're going to want to squirt out and go away from this high pressure. So this pressure difference is called hydrostatic, sort of physical pushing on the molecules. And it's going to be particularly important for cardiovascular and renal physiology, as we'll see. Not so important really for sort of movement in and out of, it's going to be a smaller player for some of the things we're going to talk about in the first part of the course. Electrical, like neurons and that kind of thing. But it's going to be quite important for really cardiovascular, respiratory, and renal. Okay. All right. So I think I'll begin. I'll stop here with part 1 and begin part 2 next.